So now let's talk about which programs to use for digital painting. When it comes to deciding which software to use, figuring out what you need depends on your goals and personal preferences, of course. I'll walk through my experience and thoughts on the pros and cons between Procreate and Photoshop, then break out my recommendations based on common user types. Before we get into those two, you're probably wondering, are those my only two options? No, there are many other programs out there, and some are especially better suited for certain tasks, such as Clip Studio Paint for comics drawings. But to me, these are the main contenders when it comes to digital painting in general. When I started out on the iPad, I tried a ton of apps, from Tayasui Sketch to Adobe Sketch Program to Paper by 53. I think Procreate might have a slightly higher learning curve than all of these, but it's definitely the best in terms of ease of use balanced with powerful features. As for Photoshop, there is a free desktop alternative called GIMP, but I've never tried it personally, and I hear it's more of a great alternative for photo editing rather than digital drawing. Adobe's full Creative Suite made more sense for me and my workflow, so Photoshop is definitely my go-to. So here's how you find Procreate on the App Store really quick. You navigate to the App Store on your iPad, and then you just come here, click search, Procreate, and it looks like this. Yours will have the price. Since I already have it, it will say update here. But just to give you a glimpse at all the types of work that you can create in Procreate, it's really amazing, and the reviews reflect how many people enjoy using this. And for Photoshop, you can actually get that through Adobe's Creative Cloud. You can get a free trial and then give it a go, and after that, it's just $10 a month. In a nutshell, I think Procreate is the future, but there are some things at the moment at a more advanced level that only Photoshop can do. If you just want to focus on illustration and digital painting, Procreate is really all you need. You can see even from the sample work that professionals are able to create amazing pieces with just this app. It's also an incredible deal at its fixed price point, and it's very convenient. The main pro to me is that Procreate is mobile. You can create anywhere when you're on your iPad. It's simple and it's super intuitive, and it's way cheaper than getting a Cintiq, a computer, and a Creative Cloud subscription. Plus, it's constantly being updated and has a great community. I also want to point out that Procreate's time-lapse capture is amazing. So what that means is that when you are drawing in Procreate, as long as you kind of keep this default function on, there is an ability where they have a time-lapse recording of what you're drawing. So when you hit time-lapse replay, you'll see your illustrations come to life, and it somehow doesn't take up that much storage, so I have this time-lapse replay available for every single one of my Procreate drawings, and even on the smallest storage capacity iPad, it's not created any problems. So I find that to be really impressive. And so now, what about Photoshop? I would be careful not to confuse Adobe's iPad drawing apps such as Sketch and Adobe Draw with Adobe Photoshop, its desktop application. The main pro for me is being able to easily organize layers and use non-destructive adjustment and masking layers. If you're not familiar with those terms, I'll definitely get into them later. But in summary, it's just more powerful and more flexible than what the current iPad drawing apps are able to do. It's also way better for design and using artboards and creative ways to save out assets, which again I'll get into more later. So for someone like me who needs to, for example, create different dimensions of illustrations to fit into, for example, mobile versus websites for clients, it's much better for my workflow to have that all organized in Photoshop rather than in something like Procreate. But on the other hand, for the initial process, I still really like drawing it on the Procreate app and then moving it into Photoshop. Another thing is that files in Photoshop can be much larger than it is on the iPad. I still also feel that Photoshop's brushes provide more flexibility when readjusting for size. So in conclusion, if you're just drawing digitally as a hobbyist and are debating between the two, I'd say go with the iPad Pro and Procreate. It overall costs less, is super enjoyable to use, and you can do all you really need on it. Plus, watching your time lapses is surprisingly fun. If, on the other hand, you potentially want to become a professional illustrator or digital artist, Photoshop may be the better choice to learn if you have to choose just one. It's also really easy to pick up Procreate afterwards if you already know how to paint in Photoshop. Finally, if you're already using Photoshop, I highly recommend tackling Procreate as it can really improve your workflow and allow you to work from anywhere. Before we move on, I want to make a quick note about the difference between pixels and vectors. Digital illustration and digital art generally refers to both. Procreate and Photoshop both paint with pixels, which you can think of as individual little dots. It allows for really fine details and beautiful gradients and textures. On the other hand, Adobe Illustrator and iPad apps such as Autodesk Sketch and Adobe Draw use vectors, which forms images through mathematical path calculations. This means you can get super smooth graphics, which is great for things like logos and graphic art, but it also feels a little less like actual painting, so it's not as great for things like textural concept art. As someone who likes traditional drawing, I enjoy pixel painting way more than vector coloring, as it feels more natural to me. On the other hand, there are people who feel they can't or don't like to color or draw the traditional way, but create really amazing, beautiful work with paths and shapes. I'll be focusing on pixel painting in this class, but wanted to explain that difference. A lot of the super clean graphic illustration you see was probably done with vectors, while the ones that seem like traditional art was probably done with pixels. That said, there's more and more overlap between the two these days, especially as Illustrator gets better with textured brushes and people figure out how to create smooth graphic looks in Photoshop. And that's part of the reason why seeing everyone's different process is fun and enlightening. So with that out of the way, let's get into my personal setup in Procreate and Photoshop. I'll see you in the next class.